Hello, and welcome to the latest installment of KRAD COVID Readings. I am Keith R.A. DeCandido, helping make the pandemic palatable by reading my writing. We've got a special thing this week. We're going to do a 5-part story, so I'll be releasing a new episode each week, starting today with the story The Unhappy Ones, which appeared in the Star Trek anthology 7 Deadly Sins. I'm reading that in honor of the release of the Star Trek Adventures Klingon Empire Core Rulebook, which is the latest addition to the role-playing game Star Trek Adventures, focusing obviously on the Klingons. I wrote several chapters in it, and you should definitely check it out from Modiphius Games. If you go to modiphius.com, you can get a PDF preview of the book right now and pre-order the book itself. I also did an event called Day of Honor, which a bunch of different Star Trek licenses got together to talk about all things Klingon. It included me joining by Rick Sternbach, Derek Tyler Attico, Kelli Fitzpatrick, and a bunch of guys from Modiphius, Jim Johnson, Sam Webb, Chris Birch, and Nathan Dowdle, talking about Star Trek Adventures, and Rick also had some great stories from when he worked on Star Trek The Next Generation as well as an illustrator. There were other events too involving shipbuilding and live-action role-play, streaming stuff, and bunches of other things relating to both Star Trek Online and Star Trek Adventures, concluding with a bunch of actors and linguists talking about portraying Klingons on screen. That included Mary Chieffo and Kenneth Mitchell and Jane Brooke from Star Trek Discovery, as well as a bunch of other actors who've worked on Discovery, and also Discovery's Klingon linguist and Klingon dialect coach. Very cool stuff. There should be a link to it below here. Anyway, in honor of all this, I'm going to be reading this story, which is my first and only time so far writing 23rd century Klingons. I've written 24th century Klingons quite a bit, but in the original series, Klingons were vaguely humanoid. And then, starting in Star Trek The Motion Picture, every portrayal after that had them with cranial ridges. The TV show Star Trek Enterprise established why that was, that there was some experimentation done involving genetic engineering with genetically engineered humans, augments, and it wound up turning a whole bunch of Klingons into smooth-headed people without cranial ridges. It was established that both Kor, Kang, and Koloth became friends. These are the 3 main Klingons we saw in the original series. They were seen together as old friends on Deep Space Nine's Blood Oath, and also with cranial ridges, oddly enough. While how the Klingons got their grooves back, as it were, was done in a novel called Forged in Fire by Andy Mangels and Mike Martin, what I was interested in telling was a story that involved Kor, Kang, and Koloth working together early on in their careers, during when they still had smooth heads. To that end, I did that story for 7 Deadly Sins. The concept of this, which was created by Marco Palmieri and then executed by Marco and Margaret Clark, was each sin being represented by a species, or in one case a location, in the Star Trek universe. So you had Pride, which was represented by the Romulans. Envy was represented by the Cardassians. Gluttony by the Borg. Greed by the Ferengi. Lust by the Mirror Universe. Sloth by the Pakleds, that's my favorite, and the Klingons were anger, or wrath, and I did that one. So without further ado, here is the first of 5 parts of The Unhappy Ones from the 7 Deadly Sins anthology, dedicated warmly and lovingly to John Colicos, William Campbell, and Michael and Sarah. Chapter 1. Malbec. Malbec found Krav's body when he arrived at the mine in the morning. Krav hadn't been in his bunk when Malbec had awakened, but Malbec had assumed him to have simply risen early. He did that sometimes. But then Krav hadn't been at the morning meal either. Krav and Malbec had taken most of their meals together since the latter's arrival at the dilithium mine here in Beta Thoridar's asteroid belt, a turn previous. Malbec had been left to have his Raktajino and ramjet egg soup alone. Still, Malbec hadn't been overly concerned. Krav had probably just taken the earlier shuttle to Site Wedge, where they both toiled. But when Malbec had boarded the later shuttle, then he started to fear that something was wrong. Galar wasn't on the shuttle either, which meant that he had also taken the earlier shuttle. There were only 2 that ferried workers to Site Wedge each morning. The last 3 days had ended with Galar and Krav arguing with each other, and if they had been on the early shuttle together, it didn't bode well. Sure enough, Galar was already there, leaning against a pillar, chewing on a gamey klongat leg, talking with another worker. Both Galar and his friend were HemQuch. A joke Galar told, they both laughed. At a joke Galar told, they both laughed and then butted their deeply ridged heads together. Malbec had bridled at that. He was QuchHa, and if two such Klingons performed that action, it would cause permanent damage to their weak, earther-like foreheads. Galar had seen Malbec watching him and his friend, and sneered. "What are you looking at, Patach?" "Nobody of consequence," Malbec said, and then moved on, looking for Krav. Galar tossed the gristle-laden klongat leg bone aside, and it hit Malbec in the arm. Malbec turned to glare at him, but said nothing. "Keep walking, QuchHa," his friend said, and then threw his head back and laughed. It disgusted Malbec. He was here doing honest work. He earned money so that his mate and daughter on Memphis 7 could eat and pay the rent on their meager dwelling. Galar and his friend, though, they were criminals who were paid nothing. They were simply working in the mines by way of shortening their sentences. Yet they looked down on him. Soon Malbec found Krav's body, wedged between a support beam and a cave wall, his dead eyes staring straight ahead. A blade of some sort had ripped open his throat. Immediately, Malbec pried his friend's eyes open wider and screamed to the heavens. The scream was interrupted by his section chief, Cow. "What in the name of Kalis' hand are you doing, Malbec?" Standing aside, Malbec revealed the corpse of Krav. "Someone has killed Krav. I was merely warning the Black Fleet." "Of what?" Cow asked derisively, staring at Malbec with beady little eyes under deep ridges. "Now I've seen everything. A useless mine worker is commending the soul of another useless mine worker to Stovokor, as if he were a Klingon." Malbec bridled. The death scream was, strictly speaking, a ritual of the warrior caste. It was not generally used by lowly laborers. But Malbec thought that Krav deserved something. After all, whatever his appearance, his heart was Klingon, as was Malvec's. "I am sure that Galar did this," Malbec said. "He and Krav have been arguing for several days, and..." Cow chortled. "First a warrior, now an investigator? You do have many talents today, Malbec. Get to the landing bay. This area will be sealed for 1 hour while security deals with it." Malbec considered arguing, then realized there was no point. Cow was hardly going to accept his word. An hour later, Sorkav, the head of security, and also the brother of the mining operations supervisor, Kobik, had gone through the scene and declared the death an accident. Malbec was aghast. All the workers were filing back out of the landing bay into their places of work to begin meeting the day's quota, which would be complicated by the late start and by being one person short, though the latter affected only Cow's section. Cow was thus likely to be even surlier than usual. "How does someone accidentally get his throat cut?" Malbec asked. The question was rhetorical, but a worker behind him, Nargov, who worked in Malvec's section, answered, "I heard he was buried under a rock slide." "No," said another. "He tripped and cracked his skull on the wall." Another, a HemQuch, like Galar, said, "I would expect no less of a weakhead." Whirling around, Malbec said, "I found the body. Krav's throat was cut. That cannot be an accident." "Quiet!" yelled Cow from in front of the cube. "Report to your duties in silence!" Malbec did not speak after that, but he was livid. His friend was dead, probably killed by Galar, and nothing would be done. Once a death in the mines was declared an accident, that was it. There would be no further investigation. Unlike Malbec, Krav had no family. He'd been born an orphan, and working in the Beta Thoradar mines was a step up from the other jobs he'd had over the years. So Malbec was truly the only one to mourn his death and take action. Perhaps he would not be able to commend Krav's spirit to Stovokor, but his friend's death in this life would be avenged. That night, Malbec took the evening meal in the mess hall as usual. The room, which serviced all 3 asteroidal mines, was massive, with food pickup all along one wall, and 3 rows of 20 long tables with benches on either side. Generally, people sat based on which mine they worked. Site Wa was at the easternmost set of tables, Site Cha in the center group, and Malbec and the rest of Site Wedge on the western end. The rear tables, farthest from the food pickup, were generally where the section chiefs, supervisors, and security personnel sat. The higher-ups, of course, had their own dining area. While Malbec sat alone at the end of one of the tables on the western side, several others in that area, and a few others besides, came by to offer their condolences about Krav. Nargov, in particular, was angry about how the situation was handled. Sorkov is a filthy patach. All he cares about is the ridgeheads and the quotas. None of the rest of us matter. Indeed, Malbec said. Thank you. Nargov offered his hand, and Malbec clasped it. Several HemQuch across the mess hall pointed and laughed at their engaging in a warrior's handshake, but Malbec appreciated the gesture. After Nargov went back to his own meal, Malbec finished off his plate of half-dead gak and washed it down with watery blood wine. His meal concluded, he got up and walked toward the back wall, seeking out the one person who might be able to offer more than verbal support. While most of the higher-ups were HemQuch, there were a few exceptions. One of them, a QuchHa named KRAD, also worked at Site Wedge, though he ran a different section. In fact, he was the only QuchHa who worked as a section chief. I would speak with you, Malbec said to KRAD. Section chiefs didn't eat with mere laborers, and HemQuch didn't eat with QuchHa. So KRAD always ate alone at the far end of a table that was as far from the wall as possible, while still being considered part of the place where the section chiefs ate. Malbec didn't pity him, as KRAD was well compensated for his solitude. Section chiefs made more than twice as much as miners. KRAD seemed confused by the declaration at first. Cow is your section chief, Malbec. If you wish to speak, I have spoken to Cow, but he does not hear my words. And you believe I will? There is only one way to know. Fumbling with the faded gray slab of Baccarat liver in one hand, KRAD gestured to the bench opposite him with the other. Sit. Malbec took the seat offered. Krav was murdered. Chewing his liver, KRAD said, Sorkov ruled it an accident. Sorkov is a fool! KRAD hissed, keep your voice down, you stupid Tozach! Sorkov has ears everywhere. The ambient noise in the mess hall at the heart of dinner hour was so loud that Malbec found it unlikely that anyone eavesdropped. Still, he modulated his tone. Sorkov was mistaken. I was the one who found the body, and his throat was cut. How is that an accident? You misunderstand me, Malbec. I'm not saying it was an accident. I am saying that Sorkov ruled it an accident. Sorkov's word is law in such matters, and none may challenge him. Malbec leaned forward to add urgency to his tone. He did not perform a proper investigation. I found the body, yet he did not once ask me what I found. To Sorkov, it was just another dead QuchHa, and who would miss that? KRAD rolled his eyes. Don't be a fool, Malbec. Sorkov has nothing against QuchHa. He was the one who approved my promotion to section chief. All he cares about is maintaining order in the mines. You expect me to believe that? Malbec laughed derisively. Look around you, KRAD. How many others besides yourself sit in this area of the mess hall? Plenty, KRAD said, pointing at a group of QuchHa sitting together toward the back of the middle set of tables, all wearing the dark jumpsuits of Sorkov's security detail. They all were hired by Sorkov. He chewed on some more liver before continuing. Look, I agree that there are some here who dislike our kind, but Sorkov is not one of them. He's never treated me any differently than the other section chiefs. If it was anybody else, I'd believe you, but Sorkov? He doesn't have any agenda beyond keeping things orderly. So you've said, but all you have done is convince me that he cares more about meeting the quotas than the safety of the miners. Either way, Krav's murder will not be avenged. What does it matter? We are not warriors, Malbec. Krav was not Kindi. Let it go. Malbec rose to his feet. I thought you would understand. You're just another section chief, aren't you, KRAD? You're the one being a fool, Malbec. This idiocy will just get you killed. Turning his back on KRAD, Malbec left the mess hall. He would have to find his revenge another way. Cal found Galar's body when he arrived at the mine in the morning. He muttered, "Glitch." Galar's body was wedged by the same pillar that Krav's body had been placed against a week earlier, his throat cut in a similar manner. Galar hadn't been in his bunk during Cow's bed check the previous night, and Cow had duly reported it. Now it seemed he had a good reason. Cow had come over on the early shuttle, so Galar had to have been there since the previous night. With reluctance, Cow pulled out his communicator. His section had already been behind on meeting its quota before Krav's death, and the situation had gotten worse over the past week, since Kobik had yet to provide a replacement for Krav. Now Cow was down another worker and would lose another hour's labor while Sorkav investigated. Sorkav arrived within 20 minutes, during which time Cal herded what few workers from his section were present into the landing bay for the second time in a week. Cal happened to know that Sorkav wore special boots that made him appear taller than he actually was, and Cal took considerable satisfaction from the fact that despite Sorkav's boots, Cal was a half a head taller than the security chief. Sorkav arrived at the scene with 3 guards, like him dressed in all black, and all with pain sticks and hand scanners on their belts. "Another death in your section, Cal?" Sorkav asked with a derisive snort as his lackey started scanning the scene. "Perhaps the supervision of this section requires revisiting." Cal looked down at Sorkav. "My concern is with getting my workers to provide dilithium. Incidents like this fall into your purview, Sorkav." "You're hardly achieving great things on that front, are you, Section Chief?" To that, Cal had no response, so he simply said, "How long will this investigation take?" "Well, I appreciate your desire to try to bring your returns up, Cal. I'm afraid it will not be that simple. A death in your section is one thing, but a second exactly like it? Obviously, there is more going on here than I previously believed." Cal snarled, "Don't be ridiculous, Sorkav." Sorkav snapped, his mock pleasant tone replaced with fury. "Do not take that tone with me, Section Chief!" However, Cal was unfazed. "I merely am pointing out, sir, that this death is likely to be retaliation for the previous one." "Explain." "One of my miners believed the Galar to be responsible for Krav's death, despite the fact that you ruled it an accident." Ignoring that barb, Sorkav said, "Who is this miner?" "His name is Malbec." "If this Malbec believed that my judgment was an error, why did he not lodge a complaint as per procedure?" Cal had to restrain himself from laughing in Sorkav's face. In the 10 turns that Cal had been working at this mine, Sorkav had yet to acknowledge a single complaint lodged by anyone of lesser authority. And since his brother ran the mine and was the only person with greater authority, that meant he did not acknowledge any complaints that didn't come from Kobik. "Perhaps," Cal said slowly, "he believed that the complaint would not be heard. So instead he took matters into his own hands." Sorkav shook his head. "Let me guess, this Malbec is QuchHa?" Cal nodded. "That explains it then." In fact, it explained nothing, but Cal wasn't suicidal enough to say so. He'd already pushed his luck with Sorkav. "Sir," one of the guards said, "there is blood on the victim's hands that is not his own. Scans indicate that the blood belongs to Malbec, son of Jork." "Well, that's hardly conclusive," Cal said, indicating the jagged edges all around the cave of rock and crystal both. "Miners get on each other's blood on them all the time." "True," Sorkav said, "but it does at least support your theory. We will investigate further." Cal couldn't help but notice that a DNA scan of blood on Galar's person took considerably more effort than Sorkav's people had put into their inquiry into Krav's death. Malbec stood at the front of the wardroom on the main asteroid, his hands and feet shackled, a guard on either side of him. Also standing was Sorkav. Seated around the table were all of the section chiefs from Site Wedge, with Kobik at the head, facing Malbec. The white-haired Kobik had a mud of Warnog in his hand. Malbec had only seen Kobik a few times, but every time he had that damned Warnog with him. Sorkav was laying out the evidence against Malbec to Kobik. "Scans indicated Malvec's blood on Galar's body. The testimony of Section Chief Cow indicated several arguments between Malbec and Galar due to Malvec's belief that Galar was responsible for the death of a fellow miner. His name was Krav," Malbec cried, "and he was murdered by... Arrgh!" That last came at the application of a pain stick by one of the 2 guards to Malvec's midsection. He collapsed to his knees, then was yanked to his feet by the other guard. "As I was saying," Sorkav said with a sidelong glance at Malbec before looking again at his brother, "this was corroborated by Section Chief KRAD." Sweat dripping into his eyes, Malbec bared his teeth at KRAD, who at least had the good grace to look away. Malbec belatedly realized that KRAD was Urwi, and not to be trusted. A pity he learned that lesson too late. "It is therefore my recommendation," Sorkav concluded, "that Malbec, son of Jork, be put to death for the murder of Galar, son of Merak." Kobik gulped some Warnog, most of which went into his thick white mustache rather than his mouth. Then he nodded. "It shall be done." So Sorkav turned to face Malbec, unsheathing his duktag as he did so. Malbec noticed as the side blades unfurled with a click that they were rusty and poorly maintained. He also noticed that the hilt carried the emblem of a house to which Sorkav did not belong. "And you say we have no honor," Malbec said, blinking away more sweat. Sorkav nodded at the guards, and this time they both applied their pain stick. Pain coursed through every cell of Malvec's body. He screamed in agony as he again fell to his knees. "Look at you," Sorkav said with contempt. "You wail and perspire like an earther instead of facing death like a warrior. I condemn you to die like the coward you are." Compared to the nerve-wrenching agony of the pain stick, the sudden insertion of a diktag between his ribs was hardly noticeable. But within moments, Malbec felt the life drain from him. He hoped he would be joining Krav in Stovokor. The last thing he heard was Kobik belching up his Warnog and saying, "That should put an end to all this." Chapter 2. Kobik. The Warnog tasted wrong. Kobik, son of Gorik, sighed. This latest shipment had been dreadful. His supply chief had switched to a trader whose prices were much lower, and Kobik now understood why. Warnog was the only thing that made Kobik's job bearable, and bad Warnog just made everything worse. He looked around his office. The space was functional, the decorations minimal. He had a rotating holographic image of his mate and children on one wall, an ancient mekhleth that had been forged for his house by Doming in the time of Kalis, and which was still a fine weapon on another wall, and a window that looked out onto the deep blackness of space. The next closest asteroid was many Kelikams away, too far away to be seen with the naked eye. But Kobik preferred it that way. Asteroids were hideous things, just ugly masses of rock broken up by craters. He missed the lush grasslands of his home on Tigakor. He gulped more of the wretched drink. For all its poor taste, it still was alcohol, and Kobik needed its bracing effects right now. Sorkav was on his way with a report. That meant bad news. For many turns, Kobik had run his mind quite efficiently. If there were problems, his chief of security dealt with it. Kobik trusted his subordinates, and everyone who'd been in that position had done the job well. Generally, Kobik didn't hear from the head of security unless there was a serious problem. And they were all good enough at their job that there were no serious problems. At least, that used to be the case. Then, he'd been forced to hire his younger brother. Sorkav's imminent arrival was the latest in a lengthy series of occasions on which he had to report to the head of the mine, and Kobik wasn't at all happy about it. Leaving aside the fact that it meant yet another security problem that Sorkav had failed to fix, it also meant that Kobik had to be in his brother's presence. Kobik had never liked his younger sibling, not when they were youths, and not when Sorkav would make pathetic attempts to steal Kobik's food, not when they were adolescents and Sorkav would make even more pathetic attempts to steal Kobik's women, and certainly not when they were adults and Sorkav was kicked out of the Imperial Guard in a corruption scandal. Facing pressure from both their parents, Kobik hired Sorkav to run security for the Beta Thoradar mine. Running the mine was a plum assignment for Kobik, one he'd worked many turns to earn. Being put in charge of its security was a good way for Sorkav to try to regain the honor he'd lost. Which was fine by Kobik as long as he didn't have to talk to Sorkav. The door to his office rumbled open, and in walked Sorkav. He had taken to carrying 2 paint sticks on his belt of late, which made him look ridiculous. "What do you want?" Kobik said by way of greeting. "There has been another shuttle malfunction." Kobik snarled. "That is the 3rd one this week. The maintenance crew believes it is sabotage." "The maintenance crew's grasp of the blindingly obvious is impressive," Kobik said dryly. "What are they doing to prevent further acts?" "I posted guards on all the shuttles, both when they're in transit and in the bay. I'm also running constant scans on all engineering sections and interrogating everyone who has ridden the shuttles." "I'm fully aware of the proper procedure for ferreting out saboteurs, brother. What I wish to know is what results have come from your work." Sorkav hesitated, which made Kobik grab his Warnog. "It would seem, brother," Sorkav finally said, "that Malvac's death has stirred the workers." Kobik frowned. "Who is Malbec?" "The worker who killed..." "What, the QuchHa you condemned last week?" Sorkav nodded. "What does he have to do with this?" "Several of those I interrogated would speak only one phrase, Malvac Bortas. I have also seen that phrase scrawled on the walls of the habitats and the mines." Kobik gave his brother an incredulous look. "Malvac's death was perfectly legitimate. Why are these Patachbu claiming revenge for him?" Sorkav shrugged. "They are QuchHa. Who could possibly understand how they think? If Had enough problems meeting our quotas. Kobik slugged down the last of his Warnog, then tossed the mug aside in disgust. If this idiocy continues... The spine-shuddering report of a security alarm interrupted Kobik. Pulling out his communicator, Sorkav said, "Report!" One of his staff reported a moment later, barely audible over the sound of shouting and violence. "A riot has broken out at Site Wa! We are attempting to pacify now!" Kobik immediately called up the security feeds for Site Wa on his terminal. The cracking station was a giant facility that took large dilithium crystals and broke them down into smaller ones that would fit inside a ship's engine. This particular station, and the two like it on the other two sites, were Jorvok stations, modular facilities that could easily be constructed, disassembled, and reconstructed elsewhere. They were also about 3 decades out of date, having fallen out of favor following the revolutionary work done by the Science Institute. Most dilithium mines in the Empire used the Mark Soch model from the Institute. Kobik had worked on both systems and found the Mark Soch to be smaller and easier to use, but also with a proclivity for breaking down on a monthly basis. Once you factored in the time that a Mark Soch was down for repairs, a Jorvok not only produced the same amount per turn, but also was easier for mining technicians to repair without having to wait for the Institute to send one of their specialists along, since the design was proprietary. The other advantage to using Jorvoks was that Kobik could get them cheap, since they were rarely used, and his own people could effect repairs so he didn't have to pay the Institute's exorbitant fees. Of course, the station was also more difficult to operate. Initially, he had assigned QuchHa to them, but that had proven ineffective. Sorkav had been the one to suggest letting only HemQuch operate the station, and things improved somewhat. Now, though, there were dozens of QuchHa, who seemed to have formed a skirmish line, and were throwing rocks and tools and any number of other objects at the Site Wa Jorvok. Still holding his communicator, Sorkav ordered more security to the cracking station. "What is that they're shouting?" Kobik asked as he tried to adjust the audio feed, but it just sounded like meaningless noise. Sorkav bared his teeth in disgust. "That same phrase I just mentioned. Malbec Mortas." Now that Sorkav had said it, Kobik was able to make out the phrase over the feed. As for his brother's security people, they were not having an easy time of it. Armed only with paint sticks, they were being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Within a few minutes, their numbers doubled as the reinforcements Sorkav had called for showed up. "I warned you that this might happen," Sorkav said with a snarl. "If my people had disruptors..." Kobik refused to engage in this argument again. "Do you know how much it costs to buy 500 disruptors? Besides, the prospect of your people getting their hands on disruptors is not a pleasant one." "Their brutality is what makes them good security." "Yes, and as long as it remains brutality, all is well. But I prefer that I be the one to have the power of life and death over the workers I'm responsible for. As it is, my cost-cutting measures have only staved off the difficulties in meeting the quotas. If this keeps up, we'll be shut down." Sorkav's reinforcements started to turn the tide, as the paint sticks started to be effective against the crowd. Plus, once a good number of workers fell to the ground in agony, the others started to disperse. Snorting, Sorkav said, "Typical QuchHa, backing down from a fight like cowards." Kobik stared at his brother. "Why expect any different? It's not as if they're Klingons." "In any case, brother, keep those Petachbu in line. I will not have our production slowed by this." Kieran felt his stomach sink at the sight of the line leading to the shuttle. He was already running late by virtue of the random search that had been performed of the barracks where he and the rest of his section slept. Kieran had no idea what they were looking for, but whatever it was, they didn't find it. Now they were doing intensive scans of everyone who approached the shuttle bay, which meant a line. Kieran had already missed the first shuttle to Site Wa. In retrospect, he wished he had skipped the morning meal. But without a Raktajino in the morning, he was useless for the rest of the day, and the section chief didn't especially appreciate that. The person in front of him, a Klingon Kieran didn't recognize, muttered, "We're going to miss the shuttle at this rate." "That won't happen," Kieran said with confidence. "After all, they're delaying us for the new security measures. They'll delay the shuttle, too." "Don't be so sure," the other Klingon said. "What's this all about, anyhow?" Now the other Klingon turned around. He was QuchHa, like Kieran, with receding hair, a wispy mustache, and a long scar under his left eye. He regarded Kieran as if he were insane. "Haven't you been paying attention?" "To what?" Kieran was illiterate, so he couldn't read the bulletins, and the section chief always told them about anything important anyhow. He had remained assigned to duties that did not require him to read anything. Eventually, he planned to save enough wages to pay for an education. It wasn't much, but at least it would increase his options. The Klingon with the scar said, "You don't know about Malbec?" Shrugging, Kieran said, "I've heard some mutterings about someone with that name, but I haven't really paid attention." "Malbec spoke out against Crow being killed. Sorkav, that filthy toad, Zach!" The Klingon spit on the floor at that. Kieran didn't blame him. Nobody liked Sorkav. "He ruled Krov's death an accident." "So? His throat was cut and he was stabbed in the back. How is that an accident?" The person behind Kieran said, "I heard he was decapitated." "Well, in any case, Malbec said that Galar killed Crow, but Galar's a ridgehead, so nothing happened." "Typical," said the Klingon behind him. "So Malbec took revenge on Galar and killed him. Then Sorkav actually paid attention. After all, it matters when a ridgehead dies." The man with the scar's voice had a bitter tone that Kieran had heard before. "Well, it does matter more," Kieran said. "After all, they're true Klingons. We've been infected with Earther filth." He said the words with little emotion. It was what his parents had taught him from birth, that their ancestors had been poisoned by Earthers. It was why the Empire remained at war with the Federation, though there was currently a treaty, and would continue to be until the Empire finally conquered them. Kieran had no illusions about his life. He knew that his greatest hope was to be a marginally useful cog in the great wheel that was the Empire. As a low-born QuchHa, that was the best he could hope for. The scarred man spit again, this time at Kieran's boots. "I do not accept that. We are Klingons. Our blood comes from the same ancestors. We follow the teachings of Kalis the same as any ridgehead." The line had been slowly moving forward as they spoke, and now they were within earshot of the guards, who were checking the workers. One said, "Quiet back there!" Scarface turned to face the guard. "Or what, ridgehead? You'll kill me too like you killed Malbec?" Now the guard stomped toward them, paintstick in hand. "I said be quiet. Do not make me tell you a third time, QuchHa!" The Klingon then unsheathed a duktag. Kieran had never seen a real duktag before. Cheap knockoffs, sure. But one like this, with the actual emblem of a noble house on it, that was something he never thought he lived to see. "I am Makog, son of Trell, and I challenge you to..." The guard reared his head back and laughed heartily before turning to face his fellow guards. "Look at this! This Batak thinks he's in the Defense Force!" Then he turned back and shoved the paintstick into Makog's belly. Makog screamed and doubled over in pain, dropping his dagger. Leaning in, the guard said, "Challenges are for Klingons, not the likes of you." Removing the paintstick, the guard straightened and said, "Take him to detention. He's obviously one of the agitators. We will interrogate him and learn who his fellow conspirators are." Kieran and the others went silently through the line after they took Makog away. Just as Kieran was next in line to be scanned, the shuttle engines activated with a mighty roar, and the platform rose toward the surface airlock. "That's our shuttle!" "You'll have to catch the next one," the guard said. "There is no next one!" Making a mock, sad face, the guard said, "Oh, too bad. It would seem you'll have to miss a day's work, and a day's wages. But it's not our fault!" Slapping a fellow guard in the belly with the back of his hand, the guard said, "Can you believe this? He whines like the Earther he resembles. At least his comrade had some iron in him." Kieran knew he could not win an argument with a guard, so he turned to head back to his barracks. If he couldn't work, maybe he could get some extra sleep. Maybe he'd volunteer for night shift duty to make up for it. From behind him, the guard said, "Hey, QuchHa! Don't go turning your back on me!" Pain sliced through Kieran's lower back as he felt the hot, pointed end of the paintstick strike his spine. His knees buckled, every nerve ending on fire. It wasn't the first time Kieran had been on the receiving end of a paintstick. In his youth, he'd gotten into trouble with the guardsmen more than once. Since achieving adulthood, though, he hadn't. Over the years, it hadn't gotten any less unbearable. Kieran screamed with the agony that only seemed to increase. When it finally ended, he quieted, but was unable to make his body move. "Screams like an Earther, too," the guard said contemptuously. "Take him and put him with that so-called son of Trell. They're probably in it together." As one of the other guards bent over to pick Kieran up, the miner noticed that Makog's duktag was still lying on the ground where he'd dropped it. Gathering up every ounce of willpower he could, he forced his left arm to thrust out, and his left hand to close around the dagger's hilt. A boot slammed down onto that hand, shattering bones with a snap that echoed throughout the shuttle bay. Again, Kieran screamed in agony. "Nice try, QuchHa! Take him!" A low rumble spread through the workers who waited in the line. Through the haze of agony, Kieran couldn't make out the exact words at first. But soon, as the guards hauled him down the corridor, he could make out the words of a chant. "Malbec, Bortas! Malbec, Bortas! Malbec, Bortas!" "Silence!" the guard cried, but his words could barely be heard. Kieran heard the chant grow into shouts, heard the stomping of feet as the people charged, heard the screams of pain as guards used their pain sticks, and then more screams of pain as the guards were overwhelmed. The ones carrying Kieran dropped him unceremoniously to the ground. All Kieran could see from his prone position were people screaming and shouting, "Malbec! Bortas!" and simply pure chaos. He also saw rocks flying through the air. "No!" he croaked. He didn't want this. He had talked back to a guard and then turned his back on him, so of course he was being punished. If he hadn't been so riled up by Maycog's nonsense, not to mention missing a day of work, he wouldn't have done that. It wasn't worth starting a riot over. Then he heard a crack that was considerably louder than that of his bones breaking. Then he heard nothing as his ears popped with a sudden change of pressure. Kieran's last thoughts were the realization that the dome had cracked. Kobik slugged down his Warnog, no longer caring how bad it tasted. Sorkav had increased security, but that only seemed to make matters worse. Checkpoints at shuttle bays led to workers being unable to report because they were missing the shuttles. Other workers were imprisoned for minor infractions that used to require only a quick stab of a pain stick. And the riots continued. With the greatest reluctance, and amid much complaining, Kobik gave in to Sorkov's demands, at least a bit, and allowed him to issue disruptors to the highest-ranking security members and to carry one himself. He was able to get a good price for a dozen Defense Force surplus hand disruptors. But the riots did not stop. Workers ceased production, or at least slowed it down. Graffiti of Malbec Bortas was scrawled everywhere, and the violence grew. Worse, because of the riots, the imprisonments, and the missed shuttles, production was at an all-time low. Kobik had been hoping to contain it, but then the atmospheric dome at one of the shuttle bays cracked during a riot, killing a dozen guards, 100 workers, and a score of maintenance staff. True, the latter were mostly Jegpui, but still, they needed to be replaced. Worse, it happened shortly after a convoy ship had arrived to pick up a shipment bound for the shipyards on Memphis 2. The ship's captain filed a report about the riot to his superiors. Later that day, Kobik received the inevitable call from General Coord. Swallowing an entire mug of Warnog to steel himself for the ordeal, Kobik activated the viewer to reveal the corpulent form of the general. "Explain yourself, Supervisor Kobik." Coord's voice sounded like a Sporak driving over broken glass. His crest bisected his forehead perfectly, almost as if it were pointing at his intense eyes. "The QuchHa have always been a problem, General," Kobik lied. In fact, they've been fine until this nonsense with Malbec. "You know what they're like." "No, Supervisor, I do not. You are hardly the first mind to report occasional problems with the QuchHa, but you are the only one to suffer such appalling production and personnel losses. The Organians may have prevented us from finishing our war with the Federation, but that does not mean we can afford to cut back on our shipbuilding efforts." Coord leaned forward. "Ships need dilithium, Supervisor. You received this assignment because you promised high production at lesser costs. That is not what I see here." "This is only a temporary setback, General. My security chief has employed new security measures, and once they take effect—" "Ah!" Coord grunted with a wave of his hand. "This requires more than such as you and your fool of a brother can provide." Kobik winced. "The Defense Force?" "Yes. 3 ships will be sent to deal with your QuchHa problem. Expedite the repair of your dome and supplement your security forces. These will be QuchHa ships as well." "General, with respect, I would prefer a ship of true Klingons." "What you prefer is of no interest to me. Let the QuchHa deal with their own kind, and then we will reevaluate the command structure of your mind. Out." The screen went blank. Kobik dry-sipped his mug before remembering that he'd finished the Warnog, so he threw the mug across the room. It clattered against the wall and rolled along the floor. "Fat old fool," he muttered. The general hadn't provided a timetable, didn't say which ships were coming, and threatened his position even if these QuchHa were able to bring things to order. He had forgotten that the Empire let QuchHa into the Defense Force. For that matter, he had forgotten that there were QuchHa of noble blood. The Earther disease that had afflicted several Klingon worlds a century ago did not discriminate between highborn and commoners. Still, surrounded by the rabble as he was, it was easy to forget that some of the noblest houses had QuchHa among them. They would be the ones in command of the 3 ships that Coord was sending, and they would likely know how to put their fellows in their place. to be continued tomorrow. Thank you very much for watching. Tune in tomorrow for part 2 and throughout the rest of the week for the whole rest of the story. You can find me online at DeCandido.net. Read my blog at DeCandido.wordpress.com. And please, if you could, support my Patreon at patreon.com/KRAD, where you can get TV reviews, movie reviews, excerpts of my work in progress, cat pictures, and vignettes featuring my original characters. Thank you very much. I will see you tomorrow, and please, stay safe.